My name's Sophie Ricard. I'm a parent carer and child nutritionist, and I'm also mama to my own neurodivergent boy. And I really focus on supporting parents and carers to really understand strategies that can help them feel more empowered. It can be really overwhelming when you're receiving a lot of advice from a lot of different places, Googling if you're anything like me at 2 in the morning, not knowing what to do. And so I really like to share information about strategies and tools and tips that you can use at home to make things feel more comfortable. All of my advice is very much focused on your child feeling comfortable and on starting from a place which feels right for them. So we're never looking at, I don't know, it's a very strong word, but we're never looking at forcing. We're never looking at putting a child into a situation that doesn't feel comfortable for them. And that's a lot about what we're going to be talking about today. So let's jump in. I should have had this slide up when I introduced myself. So this is me introducing myself. I'm also the founder of a company called Square Peg Parenting. And I really, like I said, it's very much focused around helping parents feel confident and helping parents feel empowered with different aspects of parenting. So today we're going to be talking about a few things. Now, obviously, each of these is kind of an umbrella term, so there's a lot going on underneath them. But we're going to be talking about feeding guilt. It is unbelievably common. To be honest, I've never talked to a parent ever who didn't have some aspect of guilt of what they were doing, what they weren't doing, what they were doing too much of around feeding their child. It's very, very common. We're going to be talking about the place I would like you to start and why. Even if you've already started, even if you already have things you've tried at home, this is where I'd like you to be. And then how to comfortably approach sensory aversion, because those two words really don't go together at all. Comfortable and aversion are the absolute opposites, but there are strategies to really connect them. It's definitely a journey. It definitely requires time and patience, but we're going to be talking about exactly how to help your child feel that each step you take is right for them. We are going to be talking about why eating feels tricky for your child. So if you have little ones around, big ones around, I would recommend that you pop in headphones. We always want to make sure that we're not adding pressure to our young people, and hearing about sort of why eating can be challenging can potentially add to that pressure. So I would say, if you're not alone in the room, then just pop earphones in. Really important to start with is that, some of you may currently be under care around feeding, may currently be under care around specific medical advice. The strategies I'm going to give you today cannot override that care. Obviously, this is a talk for many people, and it's not a one-on-one. So I don't know, each child is so different, and I don't know the specifics of what challenges your child is facing. So please know this is information to help you feel empowered. But if you have any questions about how it fits in with your current care, please do ask your medical professional. It's really, really important. None of this today can override that. So let's talk about the truth about feeding guilt. We've all had it. So what's really common is when your child won't eat, struggles to eat, sits at the table and finds eating really challenging. You feel worried. That's one I hear very often. You feel overwhelmed, that sense of what on earth do I do? I've tried this, it didn't work. I've tried this, it didn't work. So-and-so told me to do this, it didn't work. I don't know what to do at this point. You feel frustrated, which comes very quickly from overwhelm of this just isn't working. And very often I find, obviously behind all of this is so much care and so much love for our child that frustration can be very quick, because we just want them to be nourished. We want them to eat the food we know they need. So it can be a really, really emotional time. And then anger, really common when our children are not eating. It's something, I've heard from many people that a child who either isn't eating a variety of food or isn't eating the volume of food that a parent feels comfortable with, or both, is one of the most overwhelming experiences we can go through. And when we feel worried, that leads to overwhelm, that leads to frustration, it can very, very often lead to anger. And I want to share that because it's incredibly normal. I think that when we as parents and carers feel angry, especially when our children are involved at all, it feels very, we can feel very guilty around that. And it is incredibly normal reaction. So often picky eating, selective eating, fussy eating, parents feel to blame. And one of the most important things, to be honest, if you go away with anything today, this is what I'd like you to take away, that it is very much nothing you've done. It's nothing that you haven't done. It's not to do with the parent. It's really about what's going on for the child. And where this really comes from in society and why we feel so much of this is that we didn't always know what we know now. Now we know about sort of the process of eating, what's involved in eating, the physical part of eating, the sensory part of eating. This wasn't always known. And so, before all of this, people really thought it was behavior. It was your child's not eating, therefore they're choosing not to eat. And of course, we now know this is very much not the case, but that same message kind of stuck around in society. And it really fuels this belief that anything to do with eating is the parent's fault. And unfortunately, that's been quite harmful. As I said, it's not your fault. It's not anything you've done. Now, eating is a developmental skill that needs time to develop. And as we know, each child develops at their own time and their own pace. And some children need more time to develop their eating skills than others. Some children need a long time. And all of that is okay because that's their journey. That's where they are. Now, while none of this is your fault, parents and carers can play a really important role in supporting their child's development in the future. So what we'll be talking about today is tools and strategies that you can use to really support their journey and support their learning and support their comfort. So let's jump into where to start. Now, just to reiterate again, if you already are working around feeding support, you're already on a journey, I don't want you to stop that and go to here. But this is a really important place to start if you're not, because it's all about comfort. So what do we know about eating? As we talked about, eating is a learned skill. And learning to try new foods really takes time and practice. Learning anything takes time and practice. I often talk to parents about maths because personally, I'll use nice words about myself. It's a challenge for me. Maths is a challenge for me. And I often say, if I was learning to add and someone suddenly came in and said, do this algebra, I wouldn't be in a place to learn. And we forget that our young people, it's very much the same around eating, around food. It is a process of learning. So new foods can feel really comfortable and they can really feel overwhelming, especially when there's a sensory element there. And kids really need guidance and support to learn and to grow. Now, as I mentioned about me and my maths, if young people feel uncomfortable, they are not going to want to learn. And it's really not young people, it's humans, because, think about the last time you had to do something that didn't feel entirely comfortable. When you're in that place, you generally want to, for me, I generally want to, get under the blankets, watch bad reality television and eat chocolate. That's like apparently my happy place. But you're not in the mindset of, I really want to try something new if it doesn't feel comfortable. And of course, our young people are the same. So learning happens when children feel comfortable. So a scary or overwhelming experience means young people generally want to avoid it. That's absolutely human nature and it's how it should be. And a fun or comfortable, it doesn't necessarily have to be both, can be fun and comfortable, but a fun or comfortable experience means young people are more likely to be ready to try. There's always days when nothing's going to work, but generally they'll be more likely to be in the place where they feel it's a little bit more accessible. Now, I talked about how eating is overwhelming. Let's think a little bit about why. Eating is one of the very few things we do that requires every sense in our body all at the same time. And very often as adults, we really forget this. We sit down and we eat a meal, or, we eat in front of the telly, or we go out to dinner and eat with friends. And a lot of the time, we almost forget to taste what we're eating. We're so used to that process. But for our young people, especially if they have sensory sensitivities, this is very much not the case. So eating really requires organ systems and they need to work together. So it's not just one organ, but it's very much the body coordinating. requires muscles, which if you have lower muscle tone, that can be a separate issue going on while you're eating. It requires all of our sensory systems, all of them, all at the same time. It requires learning, because even if you know what you're eating, even if it's in a packet that's very familiar, there might be something different in that moment. It's very unlikely that every single moment of eating will be identical to the next one. So there's information coming in at that time. It requires development, constant willingness to change, ability of changing during that time. If you take a bite of food, the food then looks different than it did a moment ago. It requires nutrition, because obviously your body is taking in nutrients that it needs. And the environment, of course, is a huge one, what's going on around. So, for our young people, I know it'll be very common that one packet of one type of food, very often quite a crunchy dry food, will be very much accepted. But if that's in a loud, noisy place that feels overwhelming, that eating experience is therefore very different. So it's a huge amount going on. And I like to talk about this at the beginning, not to say this isn't manageable, but for us just to have that realization of how much eating can involve for our young people. Now, difficulty eating can come from many things. There's more beyond this list, but what we're sort of going to be tapping into today is fear of trying new foods. That very much can connect to that sensory overwhelm. Rigid routines at meal times, if a young person really likes things exactly in a certain way and really struggles when changes are made, which is very common. Food refusal, obviously you can see the overlap between these. And then difficulty with texture management. And I should say on here, it's beyond texture, because it could be smell, it could be the look of a food, all of those senses. Difficulty with managing any change is very common around difficulty eating. So let's look at how to help your child feel more comfortable around food. Now, what I'd like to think about is a way to help young people feel comfortable. Now, I said in the beginning, this is really a starting point. And this is a really nice place it's sort of a pause. It's a nice way to look at where they are right now, because if you think about my maths again, if I'm learning to add, what we want to do is introduce, subtracting is a little bit beyond me, but if we're learning to add, we might learn to add a few higher numbers. We really need to know where your child is right now in order to give them room to grow. So think about, what does your child currently feel comfortable eating? That's what I'd like you to, jot down for after this session. I'm going to be teaching you how to make a list of these things. And this is where they currently don't necessarily have that overwhelm that can come with new foods. So we call this their preferred food. We don't like to say favorite, because favorite foods are often either they look like a birthday party or they look like a very specific packet of a very specific food. And while those are absolutely included in preferred foods go a little bit beyond that. So it's generally foods that if you put down in front of your child, most of the time they will eat at least some of. There's always some days they won't eat any, and that might be what's going on in other places. But most of the time they'll eat at least some of that food. Those are preferred foods. Now, the reason they're so important is these are the foods that feel comfortable for your child. And as I've said, when your young person feels comfortable, they're more likely to be willing to try something new, or to be in the place to be willing to hear something new. Be in that place of little bit able to shift. That comfort is absolutely needed first. If we avoid that, then we get in the place of, I'm giving you this and I want you to eat this, versus you're not being ready, which we want to avoid. So preferred foods are the starting point for change. Now, what I often hear from parents and carers is that's exactly the food I don't want them to be eating. That's what we've had going on for months or years. That's what I want them to go beyond. Why are you telling me now that this is what they need to be eating? But remember, this is really the starting point, and that comfort is so, so important in order to grow. So what I'd like you to do is think about, this wouldn't be now, but this would be for later on. And I would say, work on this over a few days, is think about 3 columns. So the first column is the foods that your child would eat. You know what I have on here without hesitation, but let's switch that a little bit. It's the foods that if you put down, your child most of the time will eat at least some of. It could be a bite, but they're engaging with that food. That food is available to them. So for your first column, I'd like you to list these foods. Now, usually what I find is that your first thoughts will be, it might be 2 foods, it might be 3 foods, it might be 5 foods, but usually over a few days, there'll be a few more that pop up. So spend a bit of time with this. The second column, I'd like you to take these foods and separate them. Some things, that crunchy food that comes in one packet from one brand, won't be able to separate. But some foods like a pasta with butter, or pasta with plain sauce, or a margarita pizza, or, there's certain things which might be in the preferred food list that include them more than one thing in there. So I'd like you to break that down into their ingredients. If it is a very complicated stew, probably unlikely to be on here because a stew has all kinds of sensory things going on. But I use this as an example because the first thing that popped to mind has a lot in there. If it's a very complicated dish that you make at home, you don't necessarily have to list every single ingredient. But the reason we're doing this is what very often happens if you have just a few foods, if you have less than 20 foods, if you have less than 30 foods, less than 10 foods, is you're serving those same foods again and again and again and again. And young people can at times start losing those foods because they say, I've had this for every breakfast for the last 6 months. I don't want it anymore. And what we don't want is to lose those preferred foods. We want to grow from there. So column 2 is a really nice way to begin to shift. So it might be that you have that pasta without the plain sauce with something else. We'll be looking at a bit more in column 3, but it's just a way to look at, I thought my child ate what's in column 1, but actually they eat what's in column 2. It might not be that they're ready for it to be separated yet, but these are their foods. Column 2 is actually their full list of foods. And that's a really nice way you can start to then shift up a little bit how you're serving those. And then column 3, I'd like you to list some small shifts to those foods. So we've got pasta on here, for example. So it might be that you normally make spaghetti. Your child accepts spaghetti. They know that spaghetti, it has to be cooked a certain way. And you might write down on there fusilli, which is those twists. I don't know all my names of pasta, so I shouldn't have chosen this as an example, but you might write down those lovely tubes. I don't know the official name, but I gave them to my son yesterday. So it's still a pasta. From our perspective, they taste exactly the same, but it's an incredibly different experience for many children because they look completely different on the plate. So if it's something like a cracker, if they have a favorite cheese cracker from one specific brand, you might write down on there other cheese crackers that look the same, but they're a different brand. Or you might write down a cracker that looks the same, but isn't cheesy. So you're making these really small shifts. Don't jump far. It's just one little hop, but you're thinking about foods that are just a little bit of a shift from those preferred foods. And we're going to talk a bit later on about how to introduce those. So a little bit more about these. So step 1 is your child's preferred foods. Remember, they're not favorites, they're comfortable. Step 2 is how to use those preferred foods to make a little bit more variety. You're not going beyond what they already are comfortable with, but you're moving them around a little bit. And step 3 is small, and I should underline small 8,000 times there, small adjustments and changes to increase variety. What I wouldn't want you to do is change the taste and the color and the look. So because something's a cracker, don't just introduce another cracker on there. You want to have something similar. So it might be the color, it might be the taste, it might be the shape, but you want to keep them connected. So with the pasta example, the taste is still the same. The texture, for the most part, is still the same, but how it looks is different. Okay, so what I'd like you to try is, once you've done this list, and do spend a bit of time on it, I'd like you to always include food from column 1 at meals and snacks. Now, this is the moment when parents or carers say to me, but this is the food we're trying to move on from. Yes, that is true. But as I said before, this is really your starting point. So by having those on the table, it really shifts meal times, it shifts snacks to your young person knowing and trusting that there will be something at the table which is not overwhelming for them. And that's incredibly important as our starting point. We're going to be talking a little bit more later on about how to use column 3 to explore and make changes to foods. Keep in mind that your child may not recognize their internal cues for hunger or fullness. So they may either not know when they're hungry, or they may say they're hungry all the time and they're reaching for, this is often when those crunchy snacks come in. There's a lot of times of after meals and you think they can't still be hungry and they're still reaching for those. There's a few things possibly going on here that, that sensory need, but very often as well, they're not necessarily as in tune to their internal cues. Now, children as a whole are not as in tune to their internal cues for hunger. We know many young children who will say they have a tummy ache or they feel sick when they're hungry. We are more aware of this feeling means this, but it's a very complicated messaging going on there. So very often with young people, a feeling might not connect with, oh, this is what it means. The other thing is that challenges to feeding. So if there's any stress going on, if there's any changes going on, that will really shift eating. So let's have a look at comfortably underlined approaching sensory aversions. So what we've talked about so far is really that baseline, that starting point of comfort. How do you make sure that your child knows I'm going to come to the table or I'm going to be eating and there'll be something that isn't overwhelming for me? We always want to start there. But how do we grow from that? So strong behavior around foods is, I realize I'm running a bit late. It's 11. We'll see how it goes. Strong behavior around food is usually sensory reactions to the sensation that your child can't handle. It's too much for them. It's overwhelming and they just find it too much. And so they'll resist. So children who feel overwhelmed with food might want to eat the same foods over and over. They know exactly what to expect from that food. They might notice tiny details or changes to food. I find many young people scan food very quickly when it first comes out, and in that instant will judge there's something there, there's bits in that food. Wave your hands in the air if this is you, because yes, it's very, very common. And once they have that, it's really difficult to move past it because they've made a judgment there. So what do we do? Very often we'll resist if a brand or a packet changes, and then we'll have parents who are calling supermarkets and saying, you've changed this, do you have any in storage because I need this for my child? They need environment to be the same for every single meal. And this list is where, as parents and carers, we say, how can I control this all the time? But the answer is you don't want to. We need our children to be able to deal with slight shifts. So we're going to be talking about how to do that comfortably. So let's look at the strategies to support these feelings of overwhelm. So your child wants to eat the same food over and over. This is what I'd like you to try. So use your child preferred foods to make a menu. We talked about preferred foods just now. You can use, if they are fairly resistant, fairly selective, and you're starting with just very few foods, I would start with just column 1. Work for a while in just this place of comfort. It's like a sensory holiday for your child. Just live there for a little while before you move on. Make small changes to avoid repetition. This is where column 2 comes in. So you're not necessarily even changing the foods. You might just be changing how you serve them. It might be something without the sauce. It might be, I'm a huge fan personally of dinner for breakfast for young people. Generally, there's more variety. It's more likely to include protein, and it gets away from these sort of breakfast supposed tos. You're supposed to eat this food. I don't believe in that at all. I think that you should eat whatever food works for you at whatever time. There's no reason that 10 in the morning should be any different than 6 o'clock at night. So that's just me. And shift when foods are served. That's what I was just saying. Shift when foods are served so that if your child has one breakfast, try it for dinner one day and try that dinner for breakfast. It's giving them variety still within their comfort. But those changes are huge for your young person. It will help them understand that that growth can happen comfortably. So by making small changes to food, it can be even cutting something in half. It could be a chicken nugget that they really accept. You can cut that chicken nugget in half. It looks completely different. And what your young person will be learning is it still tastes the same, but that requires trust from them and the food. You can serve in a different bowl. You can serve different size pieces. So you'll help your child to avoid losing preferred foods due to repetition. So your child notices tiny details or changes to food. This is a really hard one. Try these strategies. So as I mentioned earlier, young people often scan food for differences right at the beginning of the meal. It's very quick. It's like, I'm done, I've judged, that's it. And it means a child's less likely to accept changes through a meal. It's very often why selective eaters don't like an apple, for example. Because first of all, one apple might have a bruise and another apple won't. One apple will have a stalk and another apple won't. One apple you bite into it and it's a bit more mealy, and the other one you'll bite in is a bit more crunchy. There's a huge amount going on there. But what we want as these first steps is for our young people to understand that a food, halfway through eating it, does look different than it does at the beginning. Very often young people will look at a food once and then they'll look away during eating, especially if they're being fed, they won't then look at the food. And having them understand that that food does change during the meal is really important. Talk to your child about the food they're eating. If they are looking away, you can be talking about the food that they're about to engage with, to know to let them know what you're seeing there, even if they're not able to look at that food. Notice details about the food, like changes in shape as a bite is taken, changes in temperature over time. A young person might have something that's warm in the beginning and half an hour later it's cold. Very different food. So you'll help your child be less reliant on that first glance, that scan, I call it, and more likely to look at food during the meal. This is a process. This is definitely not an overnight change. So your child resists food if a brand or a packet changes. Try this. So relying on packaging to tell a child about a food means they expect every single bite to be exactly the same sensory experience. And they expect every single bite to be the same sensory experience they had from the previous packet. So remove food from packaging. You may have heard this before. Excuse me, remove food from packaging, serve it on a plate or in a bowl. This can be a little bit of resistance at the beginning, but if this is what's normal in your household, that food on that bowl, it can be exactly the same bowl every time, or on that plate, is then what becomes comfortable. And it does mean that your child is going to be slightly more tolerant to those little normal differences in food, like a cracker that's broken that's come out of a packet, for example, because that's all on the plate together. So your child needs the environment to be the same for every single meal. Now, environmental noise, things going on, can be really overwhelming. I would like you to try and keep as consistent an environment as possible. It's hard, I know, but the reason for this is that the more we can keep the same in the environment, the more young people are going to be able to manage change in the food. If everything's changing, it becomes too overwhelming again. So obviously some extent of this is impossible. Doorbells do ring, cats do jump up on tables, but by decreasing as many distractions as possible, you'll help your child to reduce overwhelm. So let's look quickly at the sensory experience of eating. What is actually happening for your child when they're eating? So there are actually 5 steps to eating. There's 5 steps before eating, I should say. Now, I mentioned earlier that, we sit down, many of us as adults, and just eat. We might get to the end of a meal and say, I didn't really remember eating that. Like me with a chocolate bar, you get to the end of the chocolate bar and you're like, I don't really notice I ate it, which is a pity because you'd think you would enjoy it, but apparently not. So it's really normal for us to just not be aware of that sensory experience. But your child really needs to go through these stages. If they were already comfortable with all these steps, they would be eating a variety of food. So we know already that these steps need time, and they need care, and they need patience. So the 5 steps before your child will be able to eat is tolerate. Can your child be at the table with a food that is uncomfortable for them? And the answer is very often no. So we'll be looking at strategies to help with this. Can your child interact with a food? And this doesn't even mean touching. This is just interact with a food that they're not comfortable with. If they can't yet tolerate it, they're not going to be able to interact with it. So these are very much, I have them as 1, 2, 3, 4, but imagine a big red arrow going down here because the first one needs to happen before the second, and so on. Smell. This is an interesting one because smell is such a sensory overwhelm. For many of us as well, it's very connected to memory. It's very, very overwhelming. But the reason this comes before touch, which is next, is that touch is physically on your skin and can't quickly be removed. Excuse me 1 second. I do have young people who switch these around, who are more comfortable with touch first, and smell really needs to come afterwards. So of course you'll know your child best, but for the most part we introduce smell first because it's something that happens slightly outside of the body, although obviously it involves their senses. Touch comes next. Can your child touch a new food that they're uncomfortable with? You can see how these grow. If they can't tolerate the food at the table, there is no way they're comfortable touching it. And then taste. And I want to point out here that taste is incredibly different than eating. And we'll be talking about what to do with these. So then comes eating. So how do you get your child to take these steps? So you give your child opportunities to learn. As we talked about earlier, children learn through experience. Starting with that first step of tolerate, give your child experiences to learn how to feel comfortable with a new food. All we want is our young people to feel comfortable, because if they do, that variety is going to be more accessible to them, be more open to them. Now, each step must be taken at your child's pace, keeping their comfort in mind. It can't be at our own pace. You will end up going back more steps than you go forward if you're trying, unfortunately, to do it at your own pace. So use the foods from the last column of your child's preferred food list, that's column 3, to offer foods that have small shifts but are new. And begin with tolerate by introducing these foods to the home. So you might just have food around that is small shifts from what your child is already comfortable with. We always have to bring with tolerate. You might zoom past it, but always start there. Now, try these activities to interact with food without touching. So this is that first, after tolerate, this is that first step of interact. So you might discover how a food breaks when you press it with a fork. It might be you pressing with the fork and your child watching, or your child just there, which might be around tolerating. Discover how a food sounds when it's shaken in a cup. Your child might watch food being cooked. You might name the colors, shapes, or smells of the food you're cooking. So you can see how this seems like a very, very small step, but tolerate and interact have to happen first. So smelling, this is a little bit trickier. And if your child is overwhelmed by smell, we'll be talking about what to do around this. So discover smells of an ingredient before it's cooked, and then discover smells of the ingredient after they're cooked, because they can be incredibly different. And when we talked earlier about starting to increase tolerance of the idea that food changes, this really taps into that. Now, touching food, again, can be really overwhelming. So try creating towers of food, trying to build the biggest tower. For those of you who have competitive kids, this is great because you can maybe let them win, maybe you're a family who don't let them win, whatever works for you. And it can be many different kinds of food. If you're introducing, if you're thinking about vegetables, something like a cucumber can be great because it slices very well. It's a little bit wet, but that wet doesn't stay on your hands very much. But you can also start with just very dry crackers to have your children start engaging with these activities. You can use food as a paintbrush with paint or water. You can use really small pieces of food to play table football, flicking towards the end of the goal. Now, for those of you with young people, teenagers, these might feel like, this isn't fun to play. But these are practice, just like me with my maths. These are practice. So we don't have to say to our young people, let's play the funnest game of all time right now. It could be, let's try out this food. And it doesn't have to be hugely fun. It also doesn't have to be hugely long. It can just be a minute. And they can also help you tip chopped ingredients into a bowl. So tasting, you could put small pieces of food into an ice cube tray to taste. I love ice cube trays because they don't hold much. So it's really just teeny tiny amounts of food. The pressure is lower because you're not presenting, a roast chicken and saying, "Ooh, eat this." It's teeny tiny amounts of food. You could taste frozen, cold, and warm food of the same food. And I'm a huge fan of sprinkles. So you can use teeny tiny pieces of chopped up food as sprinkles. You can sprinkle them just onto a plate or onto other preferred food. Do keep in mind, as we've talked about so much, sensory experiences can feel overwhelming. So notice how your child reacts to the sight, the smell, the touch, and the taste of each food. If you notice any overwhelm, they don't have to feel, it doesn't have to be something that is their favorite activity. But if you notice that sense of overwhelm, if you notice discomfort, either pause there or go back a step. I'd much rather you go back a step and stay there for a little bit longer than go into a place where they might be uncomfortable. So if your child does struggle, reassure them that they're okay during a sensory experience. It is very overwhelming. And try labeling the problem. So it might be too wet. It might be too strong smelling, it might look mushy, label it, because there is something going on which feels too much. And if we name it, it can take that feeling of everything's too much and place it on just the item that they're struggling with, which can be helpful. So some tools to manage potential sensory overwhelm. So strong smells, you can wave them away. I'm a big fan of having something, big notebook nearby, wave it away. You can open the doors, open the windows, have a fan nearby. Dry, wet hands. I would say with all of these, in a minute, I'm going ahead of myself, I'm going to say to you, think about the ways that you might prepare ahead of time when your child might have sensory overwhelm. So these are things that are good to have on hand already. So if you decide to use a fan, have it there, have it at the table. So wipe foods from hands or face with a damp cloth. These face cloths are really great for those because they don't drip water. Hold food with a napkin. If it's too much to hold in your hands, you can hold it with a napkin. Cover food with a napkin. If it's on your plate and suddenly it's just too much, you can cover it up. Or chop food into small pieces. Obviously, choking is an issue here, so if your child is going to struggle with that, do not do this. But a small amount of food is going to be less overwhelming than a large amount of food. So try this, as I just said, create a list of ways to make your child's sensory experience feel easier. Have those on hand, have the list on hand or have the tools on hand so that it becomes normal, it becomes what you have around eating. And do keep in mind their reactions to these different senses going on. Is it the smell that's really too much? And you want to work with foods that don't have as strong a smell first. So that was a lot, but let's think about avoiding battles. Now, as we said in the beginning, some of you may not have mealtime battles. It slightly depends where your child is around eating, and it depends how your family is interacting around the table. But these are really around why eating could be challenging. So your young person may know that you have the expectation that they need to eat, especially when it comes to the dinner table. That's why we're there. We sit down to eat. Now, you can also see your child eating at the table. You know, if you eat across from them, there's this sort of, I'm watching you right now, which can put pressure on them. They know that you can see what they're doing in that moment. Everyone remembers meal times that didn't go well. We have all had them and are generally worried that this might happen again. There's always this for us as parents and carers. I remember when I said that and I wish I hadn't said it. Or for young people, I remember when I tried that and I really hated it. Or I remember, you know, when this happened. And that worry is always there. And meal times are really a very short amount of time with a huge amount of pressure. I often think about it like New Year's Eve. You know, it's this one evening where it's like, it has to be the most amazing evening of your whole life. And I don't know about the rest of you, but it so rarely is. And meal times is like an everyday variety of New Year's Eve. So we really want to remove the pressure of that time. So let's look at how. This is one of my top tips, really. Teach your child to spit. Now, I don't mean spitting all over the floor. I don't mean, you know, making it big and dramatic where we'll be upset, but include a paper napkin. I understand paper is disposable. The reason I say paper is it's a really nice way to then have it completely removed afterwards, and they know that it's not the same thing that's touched again. If you're more comfortable with cloth, that's fine. But have a napkin by their plate, ideally by everyone's plate, so it's not a difference. And explain to your child or show your child how to spit out a food, just gently into the napkin, that they don't feel comfortable swallowing. Because if we think about those steps, taste has to come first. If they're not comfortable tasting, they're not going to be able to eat. And so tasting, usually we expect once something is in the mouth, it's going to be eaten, but we have to give them the ability to taste without eating. Ensure your child feels stable. So no matter what age they are, they need to feel stable in their seat. We think about this so often with younger ones, or if a young person does struggle with their stability. But with many young people, we really forget. So what I'd like you to think about is their feet being secure on a stable surface. I'm actually sitting right now on my son's old high chair that adjusts. It's my favorite one because my feet sit so stable on the floor. Either if their feet aren't yet touching the floor, you could use an adjustable chair like this one I have so that their feet are flat. And really what we want is a 90-degree angle at their knees with their feet then flat. You could fill a box with books. Don't just have an empty box because they'll kick it all over the place. Fill a box with books and put it right under them. Again, feet flat. Or, those exercise bands that are like torture and you put on, you're supposed to walk around with the exercise bands on. You can get one of those and put it across the front chair legs. It's a little bit bouncy, so it can be a bit distracting. But once that distraction of bounce passes, generally it's a very nice stability for your young person's feet, and it can easily be adjusted up and down. Give your young person experiences with chewing, so include hard foods. As tasteless as possible is great. So a raw carrot stick, it does have a taste, but it's not going to be doing as much in your mouth as some other things. A breadstick, although that has a crunch, so you have to know your child and their sensory preference. But to explore chewing during the meal. Reduce the pressure of differences. And this is a really huge one for that sensory overwhelm. So separate food by color, by texture, by size. It's absolutely okay. And I think often we get the message, you just have to rush to this stage. You want them to eat a variety of food, so just serve that food. This whole, just have it or they'll never get used to it. And I do not agree with that at all, because if we think about those steps, if you're jumping to the last step of eating and they haven't comfortably worked through those steps, that overwhelm will be too much for them to tolerate. Try a divided plate. You can buy them easily online. A lot of children's shops have them, so they just have little dividers, and it means that a preferred food can be safely away from a food that they are trying that's a little bit newer. And add new foods gently. So make small changes like we talked about. This is column 3 of that list. So cut a new shape of a same food. Introduce a similar taste. Introduce a similar color. Introduce a different temperature of the same food. Think about as small changes you can make as possible. Dips and sauces are a great way to introduce new flavors because it's something that you can control. If you are feeding your child, do be cautious of dipping something heavily because it will change the food for them. But for young people who can dip themselves, it's a really nice way for them to have control of something new. And introduce new foods in really, really small amounts. I mean, by that, I mean, a chocolate chip size, a blueberry size. To us, it seems, it's barely there on the plate, but it is there, and that tolerance can then be grown. And allow control. So if your child can serve themselves, what I really recommend is, and I apologize because it means more washing up, but put the food on the table for everyone to serve themselves. I recommend you use plates as much as possible. If it's in a bowl, very often it's difficult to see what's inside. So the second that food comes out, they scan, they judge, it's over. But if you have it on a plate, even if it's slightly going to the edges, it means that young people can see that food before and start interacting, start tolerating, start accepting that food on the table. And then your young person is going to choose which food and how much of each food to place or to be placed on their plate. And then give experiences after the meal. This is a really important time because it's the time that your young person knows they are not going to be asked to eat anymore. So scraping food from a plate into the bin, or scraping food from the plate into a storage container, or watching while you do it, or hearing as you talk about what you're doing is really important, because very few of us, if our child is scraping food into the bin, are going to say, oh, wait, can you eat that now? It doesn't happen. It's not in our mindset. And your young person will know that. It's a really safe time. So use that to help with tolerance, to help with interaction, maybe to help with touch. Could you move this food from your plate into this dish? It's okay to touch it. Here's a cloth for afterwards. And don't let your child go hungry. The advice that children will eat when they're hungry enough is absolutely not the case. And if anyone's told you that, please do get in touch with me or another medical professional, because that is not advice to follow. So you don't want your child, obviously, to go hungry if the experience of eating is too overwhelming for them. So, but what I would say is, and this was, I remember when I first learned about this, I was quite surprised by this because I think it's something we're very often told, but I prefer you not to save the meal for later on. I think it's something we almost all grow up with, this can't go to waste, so therefore you can have it later. The reason I'd like you not to do that is we don't want that food that was too overwhelming that your child couldn't cope with to be used later on. It feels almost like punishment. You couldn't do it then, but you have to do it now. I'm hungry, but this is what you've got. So try and avoid doing that. Do save the food. You can use it in different ways, but don't save that plate for them. I would suggest if you can avoid grazing between meals, try. It can be a process. But if your young person's hungry after meals, look at their preferred food list. If they have any slightly more boring foods versus the snacks that they're really, really eager to have, those are the foods you want after meals. You do want to make sure they have enough to feel satisfied, but it's not these really engaging fun foods. If they have a very limited amount of foods and those are the only foods they know that you know they'll accept, those are the foods you're going to be giving them because we don't want them to go hungry. So by making small shifts to meal times, your child will feel more able to take part in the meal and to try new foods. Now, as you can probably tell, these are all small shifts and these are all focused on where we started this talk around comfort. And that's exactly where you want to be. So it is a roller coaster. I have lots of parents and carers saying to me, you know, we took 3 steps forward and then we took 52 steps back. What do I do? And that's incredibly normal. You know, you want your child to eat now. You want by the end of today for this to be solved. You've got a lot on your plate and you just want this to be easier. And I recognize that. But guiding your child to try a variety of food needs to take time. Personally, I would always rather a parent or carer came to me and said, you know, we've been doing this for 2 months and I've seen these tiny changes, than someone come and say a week later, it's completely different, because those small changes are the lasting changes. So that's really where I'd rather you be. So consider this a bit of a marathon. It requires time and patience. It absolutely requires patience on your part. And I realize that and recognize that. Avoid rushing yourself or your child as you'll both feel uncomfortable. And this really goes for your own feelings too. Notice the small changes. It can be really hard for us. I know with my own son, you look for the big things and you look for the things that, you know, other parents are talking about. And it can be really difficult to focus on these really tiny changes. But when it comes to food, that's what you're looking for. The slight tolerance of something new, the willing to touch something new, the asking about something. They're really, really small changes. And do get some support for the marathon ahead. I want to pop this in again. We talked about in the beginning, but of course, the advice I gave you tonight cannot override any of the advice you've received already, any medical advice, because this is not for your individual child. But if you do have any questions, we'll have a Q&A after this session. But if you have any questions about your specific child, please do reach out. My email's on here at sophie@squarepegparenting.com. I also have my Facebook on here. Please do reach out. If it is beyond my remit, I will signpost you on as much as I'm able. But if it's something that is to do with the work I do, I'd love to be able to give you more support.